She was born in a minor court, the sort of place that called itself a principality, but lived like a forgotten parlor, quiet, formal, dusted with old titles and older disappointments. They named her Sophie Friederike Augusta, a child of no great wealth, no real power, but power has never been about what you hold. It's about what you see. And Sophie, she watched everything. Even as a girl, she had a stillness that unnerved her tutors. She didn't fill the room. She waited for it to echo. Her mother, cold and sharp as winter light, shaped her like a weapon, dressing her in discipline and diplomacy. Her father was forgettable, but Sophie remembered everything. She read at night by stolen candlelight. Voltaire, Plutarch, devotionals, yes, but with a suspicious eye. She learned languages like secrets, wearing them beneath her breath. When she asked questions, they weren't childish things. They were precise, surgical. Why do men rule? Why must one believe what one is told? What does a crown weigh? By the time she was 14, the Russian court had taken notice. They were looking for a bride, a quiet girl with good blood and pliable manners to marry the Grand Duke. Sophie's mother all but glowed at the letter. Russia, the Romanovs, a throne carved from frost and ambition. Sophie said nothing, but when she read the letter, she smiled. She knew what it meant to be chosen. They dressed her in heavy furs and placed her in a carriage that would carry her east across snow-covered countries and political silence. Behind her, the narrow towers of her childhood. Ahead, the iron palaces of St. Petersburg. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She only pressed her fingers against the glass and whispered a farewell to the world that had raised her small. She would not return. Not as Sophie. Not ever. She crossed into Russia beneath a sky made of ash and distance, wrapped in silence and winter. The roads were frozen, the wheels groaning beneath the weight of a future no one dared name aloud. Inside the carriage, she sat alone, gloved hands resting on a closed book. She didn't read. She had already memorized the pages. The rest of the journey would be for remembering, for becoming. They called her Princess of Anhalt-Zerbst, an insignificant name, easily forgotten, like a breath lost in snow. But she would not be insignificant. Not for long. Russia was not a place for softness. It was a land of ice and iron, of bearded generals and watchful priests, where crowns were given only to the ruthless or the useful. She intended to be both. The nights were long and the fires smoked. She listened to the guards whisper outside her window, speaking of her as if she were not awake, not listening. But Sophie had learned long ago how to be unseen, how to disappear into her own quiet, and in that quiet she practiced her Russian, lips forming new shapes, each word an offering to the country she had not yet touched. She fell ill once, crossing through Poland, fever, delirium. They said she wept in her sleep, that she cried out for her mother. But they lied. She remembers the night clearly, the sweating, the ache, the taste of salt and silver in her mouth, but not weakness, never that. In the morning, she sat up, drank boiled water, and asked for a map. By the time the carriage reached Moscow, she no longer flinched at the cold. She had taught herself not to. The snow felt different there, older somehow, heavier, the kind that doesn't just fall, but settles into the bones. The people bowed low as she passed, eyes flickering with curiosity, suspicion, the faintest glint of hope. A foreign girl, pale and serious, bound for the Grand Duke's side. They thought they knew what she was. They didn't. Soon she would stand before the Empress Elizabeth and renounce her past, her name, her faith. She would kneel beneath icons painted in gold and blood, and she would rise as Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine, Russian by name, Russian by vow. But the transformation had already begun, long before the Orthodox blessing, long before the dressings and rehearsals and courtly recitations. It had started here, on the road, in the cold, in the hush between border towns, in the spaces where her old life fell away and her silence turned sharp. She did not become Russian. She consumed it. They dressed her in gold. Not the soft, glowing gold of summer, but the hard kind, cold, polished, unyielding. It clung to her like prophecy stitched with pearls, heavy with centuries of expectation. The chapel glittered. The choir sang. The bells rang over St. Petersburg like iron warnings. And in the center of it all, Catherine stood still. She had practiced the moment endlessly, how to bow her head, how to look up at the icons as if she believed, how to accept her fate with grace. And she did, perfectly. Each movement quiet, deliberate, controlled. The Grand Duke stood beside her, awkward and pale, his powdered wig sitting too high, his fingers twitching at the folds of his sleeves. He didn't look at her, not once. When the priest spoke the final blessing, she didn't blink. The moment passed, and the crowd erupted into the echo of celebration. But Catherine listened to the silence underneath it, that soft, hollow hush that comes when something has been taken and nothing yet given. Peter was strange, petty, sometimes cruel, a boy trying to wear a man's crown before his voice had fully settled. He collected toy soldiers and talked to them in whispers when he thought no one heard. He spat at the servants. He drank too much, laughed too loudly. He hated Russia, hated her even more. She was too clever, too composed, too silent. She reminded him of what he would never be. Their wedding night was a formality. 2 rooms, 2 closed doors, 2 lives set side by side like chess pieces that would never touch. She smiled when required. She answered every insult with softness, not because she was weak, but because she was listening. At court, they watched her, every breath she took, every blink. They searched for scandal, for evidence of failure, but found nothing, only poise, only restraint. She knew their games, and she played none of them. Instead, she read, studied, observed. She found the cracks in the walls, the flaws in the men who ruled, and she waited. She waited while Peter sulked through ceremonies, mocking tradition and painting himself in the colors of Prussia. She waited while the empress grew older, heavier, more desperate to preserve the Romanov line. She waited while the nobles whispered about heirs and blood and legitimacy. And in the silence of her chamber, beneath the weight of pearls and expectation, she built herself, not into a wife, into something far more dangerous. There is a kind of silence only palaces know. It settles in the corners of velvet-draped rooms and polished marble halls, not empty, but watchful. In that silence, Catherine lived, not as a wife, not as a duchess, but as something undefined, unclaimed. She would walk in the winter garden when the court still slept, frost pressing against the glass, breath blooming white in the air. The orange trees there didn't fruit in winter, but she didn't come for beauty. She came for the quiet. Among the bare branches and dying roses, she read by the thin light of snow. History, law, philosophy, Russian customs, Roman empires, and always faces. Faces from portraits that watched her back. Faces in the halls, in the mirrors, in the spaces where power lingered like perfume. Peter wandered elsewhere, in other gardens, with other women, and always with his toys, those wooden soldiers, painted and dressed, and marched in endless, pathetic parades. He had no love for Russia, and none for her. When he spoke of her, it was with mockery. When he saw her, it was with boredom. But Catherine never reacted. She gave him silence in return, the kind that unsettles. They watched her, his friends, the courtiers, the guards, wondering why she stayed so quiet, why she smiled without warmth, why she never wept. Some thought she was cold, others thought she was weak, but what they couldn't see was what she had already begun planting in that silence, a root system of loyalty, of knowledge, of names remembered, secrets stored, promises made in whispers and wine. She grew ill that first winter, not theatrically, quietly, pale skin, a bleeding cough, nights spent sitting upright, breathing shallow. They sent doctors. Peter mocked her, but she endured it all without complaint. Even sickness she endured with elegance. And when spring returned, so did her strength. By then, she had learned the patterns of the palace, the way power moved, whom it avoided, where it liked to hide. She had learned when to bow, when to disappear, when to let someone else speak and listen instead. She had learned how to make herself valuable without making herself seen. She was not yet empress, not yet mother, not yet legend. But she had become something more important. She had become essential. There is a moment in the life of every woman kept in a gilded cage when silence becomes too sharp to bear alone, when the ache beneath the ribs turns from longing into strategy. Catherine knew that moment well. She didn't fall in love, not at first. Love was never the goal. What she found was attention, soft words in candlelight, a voice that didn't condescend, a pair of eyes that looked at her not with pity or suspicion, but hunger. His name doesn't matter, not in the end. History reduced him to a footnote, but in that quiet corridor of her life, he was a door. It began in whispers, as all dangerous things do, in passing glances, in shared shadows, in the long pause between a question and an answer. He was young, charming, clever in a way that Peter never could be. And she was careful, always careful. She chose when to lean closer, when to laugh, when to let him believe the idea was his. He loved her, of course, or thought he did. Men always believe they've discovered something rare when a woman like Catherine gives them her gaze. He believed he was the key to her liberation. He was wrong. She had already unlocked the door. He was only the one she allowed to walk through it. Their affair was a secret, but not silent. Secrets have a rhythm, the thrill of discovery, the pulse of danger. She would walk past him in court without a glance, then find him after dark, behind the tapestries, in rooms that didn't belong to either of them. Their bodies spoke the language she had been denied since her wedding night. But even in pleasure, Catherine watched. She watched who noticed, who whispered, who turned away. She gathered names, built a map of allegiances across sheets and stairwells. The court thought she was distracted, softened by desire. But desire was never her weakness. It was her weapon. And when the whispers finally reached Peter, as they always do, he raged, threw chairs, broke glasses, but did nothing. Because by then, Catherine had grown something more potent than love. She had grown loyalty, and the court had begun to lean toward her, not with affection, but with respect. They saw something forming in her, something Peter could not touch, could not match, could not name, and so he retreated, back into his games and drunken furies, while Catherine, behind her still gaze and quiet hands, began to imagine a different kind of future. Not as consort, not as wife, but as ruler. The palace changed when death began to walk its halls, not loudly, not with panic, but with the slow, careful hush of something ancient drawing near. Empress Elizabeth had ruled Russia with gowns that weighed more than soldiers, with commands like thunder dressed in perfume. She had been power itself, wrapped in lace and appetite. And now, she was fading. The corridors grew quieter. The bells rang slower. Physicians came and went with solemn faces and hands that trembled behind closed doors. And Catherine Catherine listened. She watched. She moved through the shifting silence like smoke, never hurried, never still. She did not mourn the empress, not openly. That would have been premature. But she paid respect in the way that mattered most. She remained present, calm, impeccably dressed, a step behind, a breath away. She knew what it meant to be seen waiting, to let the dying understand that she was ready, but not eager, never eager. Elizabeth's illness dragged through winter, fevers, delirium, days when she barked orders to ghosts, nights when she whispered to no one at all. Her courtiers scattered, each aligning themselves with whichever wind seemed strongest. Some ran to Peter, clinging to their futures. Others began approaching Catherine in quiet. Small gifts, short letters, careful words, all of it folded into her growing shadow. Peter was restless. He mocked the doctors, paraded through the palace halls in foreign uniforms, threatened servants with wooden swords. He wanted the crown so badly, it leaked from him in sweat. But Catherine, she showed nothing. Her face was the calm of deep water, her hands steady, her smile slight and unreadable. She did not reach for the throne. She simply stood where it would fall. When the empress finally slipped beneath the waves, late one night, without ceremony, the palace didn't scream. It exhaled, as if it had been holding its breath for months. There was mourning, yes, processions, black veils, golden coffins. But the eyes of Russia had already shifted. The court no longer looked to the past. They looked to the two figures left behind, the heir and the wife. Peter grinned too widely at the funeral. He smelled of wine and dust, and beside him stood Catherine, a portrait of restraint. She lowered her gaze when expected. She bowed when required. But inside that stillness, the wind had changed. The empress was dead, and the throne was moving. They crowned him in the great cathedral, beneath golden domes and ceilings thick with saints. The priests sang, the generals knelt, the court clapped their gloved hands against embroidered sleeves, and Peter grinned like a child who'd found the crown in a toy chest. He was emperor now, and the empire began to tremble. Catherine stood beside him, her face carved in quiet elegance. She wore the crown consort's jewels like frost on a flame, delicate, cold, and untouchable. She said nothing, not during the ceremony, not during the feasts, not as Peter raised his cup and toasted Prussia instead of Russia. She sat beneath the chandeliers and listened to her husband mock the very throne he now held. He changed everything, not out of vision, but out of spite. He banned Russian customs, praised foreign kings, laughed at the Orthodox Church, and threatened the nobility with reforms scribbled on the backs of wine-soaked napkins. He promoted men who flattered him and punished those who didn't play along. The army hated him, the court feared him, and the people simply watched. Catherine did more than watch. She remembered. The generals he dismissed, the servants he insulted, the guards whose pay he delayed. She moved through the palace like breath through a veil, never loud, never absent. She asked no one for loyalty. She waited for it to be offered. And quietly, it was. Peter saw none of it. He saw only his own reflection, and even that he misunderstood. He believed the court respected him. He believed the people adored him. He believed Catherine loved him. And because he believed it, he left her unwatched. She knew what to do with freedom. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The freedom to visit, to speak, to meet allies in hallways and staircases and soft-carpeted salons where doors never quite shut. She laid no claim to power. She only made it comfortable in her presence. And while Peter played dress-up in foreign uniforms and gave away lands with a flick of his careless hand, Catherine gathered names and promises, and hands that were ready to act when the moment came. He thought he was safe, that no woman would dare move against him, that Russia would follow whoever wore the crown. But Russia, even in silence, was listening. And Catherine, she was already reaching for the throne. It began with a whisper, not the kind meant for ears, but the kind that moves through corridors, through candle smoke and velvet, through the minds of men who have grown tired of being ruled by a fool. Peter was away, playing soldier in Oranienbaum, dressing up his friends in Prussian coats, parading before mirrors instead of armies. He thought the empire waited for his return. He thought Catherine waited too. She did not. They came to her chamber before dawn, not with trumpets, with urgency, with reverence, with a priest, a general, and a uniform. The moment had arrived, and it did not ask permission. She rose from bed, calm as winter light, and dressed in the colors of war, pale blue trimmed in silver. She strapped the sword to her waist herself, and when she stepped outside, the guards bowed. They did not hesitate. They followed. Word spread like heat through dry grass. Catherine had risen. The Grand Duchess had claimed the army. She had not waited for the throne to be offered. She had reached for it, not through violence, through certainty, through precision, through the quiet weight of a woman who had spent 15 years preparing for one single morning. In the barracks, they cheered for her. In the streets, they wept. She rode through St. Petersburg not like a rebel, but like a ruler who had always been, only now finally seen. The people lined the roads to watch her pass, not shouting, watching, measuring, and finding her worthy. Peter heard the news in his palace by the sea. He laughed, then he raged, then he begged, but the army did not come. The ministers did not listen. The people did not rise for him. His commands fell into silence, and in that silence he fled. Catherine had him arrested, of course. She made no show of it, no execution, no public humiliation. He was simply removed from the palace, from the future, from the story. They say he died days later, suddenly, quietly, in the custody of those who no longer feared him. They say she did not order it. And maybe that's true, but she did not stop it either. She didn't need to. She had already taken everything. When she stood before the court, no longer consort but empress, they swore allegiance without protest, without doubt, because they saw what she was, not just a ruler, not just a survivor, a woman who had waited in silence, loved in shadows, suffered with grace, and still, when the moment came, she did not flinch. The crown did not weigh her down. It settled onto her like a second skin, cool, deliberate, inevitable. She wore it not as an ornament, but as proof of survival, of intention, of arrival. Russia bowed, and Catherine stood still. But power does not come alone. There was the boy, Paul, her son. He had been born into silence, conceived in shadows, whispered about even in infancy. His paternity was a question none dared speak aloud, and yet it followed him like fog, clinging to his footsteps. Peter had claimed him, then ignored him. Catherine had carried him, then stepped away. For years he had been raised by others, wet nurses, tutors, the empress herself, and now, with the throne newly hers, he was returned to her care, returned, but not close. She watched him from a distance, a serious child, pale and thin, always watching, so much like her. Too much, perhaps. His eyes searched her face not with love, but with study. He did not reach for her. He bowed. She did not cry for it. A mother's heart and an empress's will do not always share space. She gave him every luxury, the best tutors, the finest horses, a regiment to play with and salute. She gave him titles, servants, polished halls to echo his steps, but she did not give him herself, not fully, not yet. because Catherine had no intention of stepping aside. He was heir, yes, but she would rule. He grew older, grew colder. He watched her with something more than distance now, with resentment. He saw the people adore her, the ministers obey her, the soldiers kneel at her feet. And he saw his own future drifting, slower, smaller, farther. But she would not apologize for it. She had built this reign from blood and ash and silence. It was hers. She had bled for it, starved for it, played lover and wife and widow beneath chandeliers that watched like gods. She had seized the moment when it came and made herself immortal. And Paul, he would wait, just as she had waited. Someday, yes, the empire would be his. But not yet. Not while Catherine still breathed. He did not enter like the others. He did not bow too low or flatter too much. He did not tremble in her presence. When Grigory Potemkin stepped into her court, he looked at Catherine as though he already belonged beside her. And she noticed. Not his beauty. It was there, yes, but so was ambition. So was brilliance. So was danger. He was a soldier who understood art, a strategist who read poetry, a man of appetites who never let them dull his edge. And Catherine, who had seen every kind of weakness disguised as love, felt something shift. With him, there was no performance. There was fire. It began as correspondence. Long letters inked with philosophy, plans, seduction wrapped in statecraft. His handwriting was bold, like he pressed the pen too hard. Hers was elegant, exact. Together, they drew the lines of a world they had not yet touched, but would, soon. When they met again, truly, it was not a matter of falling. It was a matter of recognition, like two storms that had circled the same sea for too long. He did not worship her. He joined her, and that was what she needed. He became her lover, yes, but more than that. He became her shadow, her mirror, her hand. Where she ruled in velvet, he moved in armor. She shaped law, he built cities. She calmed the court with silk smiles while he fortified the empire's southern edge with blood and cannon. Together, they reimagined Russia, not just larger, but more magnificent. Palaces, armies, roads that ran like veins from Moscow to the Black Sea. And always the letters between them, burning with ideas, with longing, with the strange, sweet ache of two souls, never quite able to hold still long enough to be only lovers. Some say they were secretly married, that somewhere, in a candle-lit room with no witnesses but silence and breath, she made him more than a consort. Maybe, maybe not. Catherine never confirmed it. She didn't need to. Their bond was something larger than ceremony. He was the one man who met her without trembling, who argued, who dared to vanish for months, to return scarred and sunburned from war, only to be welcomed again without apology. And in those years, the years of Potemkin, Russia became something more than vast. It became radiant, because Catherine was no longer alone in her fire. It began far from the palaces, out where the empire frayed into fields and dust, where men still plowed earth with wooden blades, and mothers fed their children stories because they had no bread. Russia was vast, yes, but vastness does not mean unity, and hunger listens better than loyalty ever could. His name was Pugachev. He claimed to be Peter. Yes, that Peter, the dead husband Catherine had unmade with silence. This man, this outlaw, this Cossack with wild eyes and cracked lips, said he was the rightful Tsar, that Catherine had stolen the crown, that the old order would rise again for the people by fire and sword. And the people believed him. Not because they were fools, but because belief is easier than despair. It spread like rot through wet grain, villages rising, landlords slaughtered, fortresses set alight. He promised freedom from taxes, from conscription, from nobility, from Catherine. She did not panic. She listened. She studied the maps, marked the routes, memorized the names of each province that turned. She knew this was not just rebellion. This was memory. Russia remembering its rage, remembering what happens when rulers forget to look down. But Catherine never forgot. She summoned generals, quietly, efficiently. She did not flinch when they brought her stories of massacres. She did not cry when towns burned. Emotion would not stop fire. Steel would. So she unleashed it. The army moved like winter across the steppe, relentless, inevitable. Pugachev's army crumbled beneath muskets and cold discipline. His followers fled. He was captured, paraded in a cage, filthy and shaking, a czar of ashes. They asked her if she wished to watch his execution. She declined. She had already buried Peter once. But in the quiet that followed, Catherine walked the halls of her palace with slower steps. She had ruled with elegance, with reason, with order. But now the empire had spoken back, not in words, in fire. And though she had crushed the voice, she would not forget the sound of it. Because beneath every throne there is soil, and in every soil something waits to rise. She wrote by candlelight, not for escape, but for clarity. Long letters, pages stitched with thought and ink, folded and sealed and sent westward, to Paris, to Geneva, to men with powdered wigs and sharpened minds who debated freedom over wine and revolution from their salons. Voltaire, Diderot, Grimm, they called her Semiramis of the North, the sovereign who quoted Montesquieu from memory, who asked about justice as easily as she asked about grain. They admired her from a distance, not as a curiosity, but as a marvel, a monarch with a crown in one hand and a pen in the other. And she admired them too, not blindly, not with girlish awe, but with the mind of a woman who had seen power stripped bare, who had worn it, wielded it, and still wanted to understand it better. She invited their ideas into her court like honored guests, spoke of law, of reason, of education. She rewrote Russia's code with hands that had once trembled in the dark. She founded schools, opened libraries. She wrote essays beneath chandeliers. She built a legacy of light, one decree, one letter, one whisper at a time. But she was not naive. Ideas could shine, yes, but they could also burn. She watched the West carefully, watched as the Enlightenment, that glowing dream of liberty and reason, began to flicker, watched as France stirred restlessly in its silks, watched as philosophers turned into pamphleteers, as words turned into weapons. She did not flinch. She adjusted. She knew Russia would not be ruled by ideals alone. She had seen what hunger could do. She had walked the scorched earth of revolt. So she tempered the light, held it close, but never too high, gave the people what they could bear, and kept the rest hidden in ink and thought and quiet conversation. There were those who mocked her, called her hypocrite, said her enlightenment was polished gold wrapped around a blade. They were not wrong, but they were not right either. Because Catherine did not rule from books. She ruled from experience, from survival, from the knowledge that power, to last, must know when to bow and when to bite. She was not a philosopher in a salon. She was an empress at her desk, one hand on a quill, the other on the map of the world. She had always dreamed in borders, not lines drawn in ink, but in rivers, in mountains, in coasts warmed by a sea Russia had never touched. The Black Sea, it called to her, not for beauty, but for meaning. Empire, after all, is not measured by what you hold. It's measured by what still lies just beyond your reach. And so Catherine reached south. The wars with the Ottomans were not sudden. They were slow, methodical, exactly the way she preferred things to begin. Potemkin commanded the southern campaigns with brilliance and cruelty in equal measure. He understood her ambition because it was stitched into him. Each fortress he captured was a gift laid at her feet. She called it expansion, others called it conquest. Let them. Villages fell, cities changed flags, and one by one the coasts shifted into her hands. Russia, cold and northern, suddenly tasted salt and sun. Catherine did not ride to battle, but the victories were hers. She plotted them in the quiet hours of dawn, dressed not in armor but silk. She did not spill blood. She gathered its results. When Crimea was taken, the court gasped, the world watched, and Catherine smiled, not for glory, but for the future. There, on the coast, Potemkin built a city from dust, Kherson, then Sevastopol, then more, each named like a promise. She ordered temples, theaters, roads wide enough for legacies to march across. Some said the villages were empty, that they were illusions built to impress her, painted facades to please an aging lover. But they missed the truth. Catherine didn't need illusions. She created realities. And when she toured the new lands, her new lands, she did not do so timidly. She arrived in a carriage gilded like a throne, escorted by troops, by ministers, by music that echoed across the steppe. It was not humility she offered the people. It was spectacle, because she understood something every ruler must. Perception builds loyalty faster than fear ever can. And no one who saw her riding along the Black Sea coast, veiled in silk, crowned in sun, would ever doubt that Russia had changed. It had grown. It had warmed. It had become hers. The streets of Paris burned, not in stories, not in rumors, but in letters, trembling across her desk like dying moths. Ministers beheaded, monarchs fleeing, the guillotine erected not as punishment, but as policy. And behind it all, a roar, a people not rising, but unraveling. Catherine had spent decades in conversation with the French Enlightenment. She had written to Voltaire as an equal. She had hosted thinkers, praised ideas, opened doors that had been locked for centuries. She believed in reason. She believed in progress. But what spilled from France was not progress. It was blood. She read every dispatch herself, slowly, carefully. She studied the names of those who fell, nobles, friends, philosophers, the same men who once praised liberty, now praised violence. They used her words, freedom, equality, but twisted, sharpened, made into blades. She did not weep. She adjusted. Overnight, the Enlightenment ended in her court. No more talk of revolution. No more speeches about rights. The books remained, but closed. The ideas, once displayed like jewels, were now tucked back into their velvet cases. Not denied, but restrained, contained. She tightened her rule, not with fear, but with clarity. Russia would not follow France into the fire. There would be no mobs in her streets, no chaos behind her palaces. She increased surveillance. She scrutinized correspondence. She watched the intellectuals, those bright, well-dressed men with soft hands and loud minds, and she remembered how quickly light could burn. Some whispered that she had betrayed the cause, that the empress who once quoted Rousseau now ruled like a tyrant. They were wrong. She had not betrayed it. She had survived it. Because Catherine understood what those philosophers never did. Ideas are not kings. They do not hold back crowds or defend borders. They do not rule. People rule. With blood and breath and the terrible grace to say no when others shout yes, France fell to fire. Russia did not. Because Catherine stood where others broke. And in that silence, she endured. The end did not come with thunder. It came with stillness. The palace was warm, quiet, wrapped in furs and the faint scent of aging roses. Outside, snow fell like breath turned to ash. The courtiers still bowed. the ministers still whispered. The empire still spun, vast and obedient. But Catherine had begun to slow. She did not speak of pain. She never had. But her steps grew smaller, her hours fewer. The great empress who once rode through the steppe like a storm now spent her mornings near the fire, wrapped in shawls, reading pages she had already memorized. Not because she had forgotten, but because remembering had become a kind of prayer. She wrote less, slept more. The letters she did send were shorter, less sharp, but still hers, always hers. She asked about cities, about ships, about how the harvest had fared in places she would never visit again. She spoke rarely of Paul. He waited, of course, always had. He circled her like a star grown tired of orbit. He wanted the crown, wanted it desperately, and she saw it in his eyes, that old hunger, that bitterness born of being second too long. She did not rush to meet it. She still ruled. Until the last breath, she would rule. But time had begun to drift differently. The fire burned lower. Her fingers trembled when holding a cup. The hand that once guided armies, rewritten law, conquered lands, now took longer to lift a quill. And then, one morning, she did not rise. A fall, a seizure. No witnesses but the silence. They found her on the floor, still warm, still regal, her face untouched by fear. She had ruled for more than 30 years, had turned Russia from a distant kingdom into an empire carved in stone and sea. She had loved, warred, written, risen. She had shaped a continent. But in the end, she was a woman in sleep. And when the bells tolled above the Neva, when the mourning clothes were drawn from closets, when the great cities lowered their flags, they did not weep for a monarch. They wept for Catherine, the woman who had once arrived in snow, a girl with silence in her eyes, who had taken a throne not meant for her and held it with both hands until the world changed. She was gone, but Russia still carried her shape.